Good afternoon and welcome to this session on Hungryalist poetry. Maitreyee, welcome to your first session at Kalam.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Chowdhury.
It's delightful
Thank you
to
everyone
have you
for
here.
coming, especially Deborah Baker, ma'am. It's a privilege to have you here.
So here we are, Maitreyee and myself, and we were sitting chatting a little bit just prior to this session, and we discovered that both of us were expatriate Bengalis, or Probashi Bangalis, as you would call it. And as you know, with people like us, we're always in search of context. So we shall begin sort of with that. Maitreyee, when I went through your book, The Hungryalists, of course, there's this whole window that opened up for me because I heard, I had certain preconceived notions about the poetry of the time and of the time itself. So my first question is, why this particular topic? I mean, what drove you?
Like you said, I'm a Probashi Bangali, like Josh said. So the story of the outsider is always very attractive for us, for people like us. And for me personally, it all began with Deborah Baker ma'am's book, The Blue Hand. Such a wonderful book, ma'am. There was a small mention of a group of writers called the Hungryalists. And I have had a bit of a research background, so I started digging from that. And I started wondering why this group of poets and writers hadn't been written of or spoken of as much as probably necessary, because whatever they were, I mean, different peoples, the Hungryalists tend to elicit very strong reactions from people. But no matter what the reactions, I thought they deserved a place in history, and I tried to give them a little bit of context in that sense. So that's where the whole idea of the book came from, and I wanted to give credence to that part, I guess. But this book, having said that, is not only the story of Maitreyee Chowdhury. It is the narrative of, the background is that of the 1962 war. It talks about a bit of the Nakshals. It talks about the poverty, the hunger, the sense of the loss of identity, all of that, the search for a new tongue, as if, all of that, and the sense of alienation in the Bengali youth at that time. So it is all of that. It is also that.
So your book is written by and large from the perspective of Maitreyee Chowdhury. And of course, he was a prominent figure in the Hungryalist movement. But there were other prominent and very, very interesting personas, D.B. Roy being one of them. Why specifically did you choose Maitreyee Chowdhury, and did you ever consider having multiple perspectives or multiple speakers for your novel? I'm calling it a novel because at some stages, in spite of this very, very academic book, I have to tell you, it reads like a novel. You actually cannot put it down.
No, I was very clear from the very beginning that the Maitreyee had to be the protagonist for this story, because the movement began with him, and he was the founder of the movement. And yeah, like you said, there were other very strong comparable stories that ran parallel. That of the story of Shakti Chattopadhyay, of course, the story of Binoy Majumdar, which is far, far less known, the story of Sunil Ganguly, which is entwined, if very differently, but entwined nevertheless, the story of Allen Ginsberg, of course. But I chose to go with Maitrayee's story primarily because I thought he had all these qualities which actually make it kind of very filmy. There's drugs, there's sex, there's academia, there's poetry, there's revolution. He's a perfect hero material here. And also, I mean, jokes aside, also the fact that Shakti Chattopadhyay, Sunil Ganguly, all have been very well documented. There's a lot of writing that has happened on them. So I thought relatively less has been spoken of Molloy, and that's one of the reasons why I chose him. About multiple narratives, I think if not in form of from the people's perspective narrative, from the perspective that the book speaks at different levels. It speaks about 62 war and people's reactions to it. It speaks about the unemployment, the hunger. It's a Calcutta speak. It's not only people speak, it's a Calcutta speak. So in that sense, it has different narratives actually. It's not only Maitreyee Roy Chowdhury's story. It's, like I said, it's finding a new tongue, it's finding a new direction for the youth. It's so much of that, especially.
You did mention that these letters in the book that carry your story forward, between Molloy and his brother Shumir in some cases, that they had an interesting, that they didn't just come about as letters. I mean, if you just tell us a little more about how you did
so
that.
Let me tell you to begin with a little about, so for me, I've always struggled with the form. Writing is something I do very easily, but when it comes to publishing, there has to be a form. So publishers insist you either put it in this bracket, you put it in that bracket. So it's a little, in my fuzzled mind, it's a little difficult for me, because I wanted it to be many stories coming into one center. So as I was going about the reading, I discovered that this would be a bit of a difficult thing to achieve with a very straight non-fiction book, because we live in the aftermath of what happened in the 1960s. Most of us who are interested in this genre, in this timeline, we are living in the aftermath, and most of these stories come down to us in the form of myths, in the form of anecdotes, in the form of various other things, but they are largely a personal perspective, and you don't know where the personal ends and the reality begins. So it was a bit of a difficult, dicey thing to make it only a non-fiction story for me. Hence the narrative non-fiction style, where there could be some creative influences. While I was doing this, there were certain conversations that Molloy had with his love interest and with others, like with Shakti Chattopadhyay or with others, which I thought could easily be converted into letters. I personally love writing letters, and I write letters to a lot of my friends. So I thought, why not make a lot of these conversations into letters, where they write to each other and the meaning is conveyed, and a little beyond that, perhaps. So that is where the story of the letters come in, and some love letters are there, which, those are my personal favorite parts of the book, actually. I think they convey far more than what actual prose conveys.
So you've used translations quite extensively wherever needed throughout the book, because it's a book about poetry of a certain time, and it's a book in English, so obviously that has to happen. Who are your favorite translators? Who have you preferred to use?
Mostly Arunava Sinha, because he has translated a lot of Bangla poetry and prose, so I collaborated with him in this aspect for most of the translations. And some of them are from academic papers which already had the translations. So, yeah.
And of course, some of the work was already there in English itself.
Some of the work was already translated, was already there, so that wasn't...
One of the most famous names of the Hungryalist generation was Debi Roy, which was, of course, not his real name. It was Haradhandhor, and he was the first Dalit poet to be publicly, I think, known as such. But of course, the context of the time was not one of acceptance, which is why he changed his name. Now, I just wanted you to touch upon that, that time and that context. And did you find, when you were writing it and thinking about perhaps our context today, if things had significantly changed or improved, or were they still sort of the same? The context of caste and Dalit writers coming into the mainstream.
Yeah, so this is something I think that is not often talked about when it comes to the Hungryalists, and I'm glad you asked this, because the Hungryalists were talking about removing class barriers, caste barriers, and elitism way long back before anyone was talking about it. So the fact that Haradhandhara, who was a Dalit writer, was named as the editor for their manifestos was a huge statement. I mean, yes, people were talking about the caste problems, class problems, but nobody made it, nobody took any action about it, to say so. I mean, people were talking about it in the private circles, of course. There were enlightened people who did talk about it in their private circles, but nobody came forward and said, hey, let's put a Dalit writer on a manifesto. I think they were the first to do that. And that was a very important statement. They went on to include other Dalit writers in their movement. There were a lot of experiments going on with the kind of writing that happened. Chhata Matha is a book of poems by Shubhimal, a very interesting experiment where the book was written in the language that Taungawalas used. So this was the first book that was, written in that kind of a dialect. It was not even a proper language. It was a dialect that most people in Kolkata didn't understand. And it left the elite very puzzled because they didn't know what to make of it. So, these were very interesting experiments. And the whole thing, the fact that they, Haradhandhara, because he had his severe insecurities, and the fact that he later changed his name to Debi Rai was because, in spite of his name being up there as an editor, he couldn't quite cope with all the problems that went with his name and with his caste. So he had to resort to changing his name. So just imagine what kind of pressure it must have been for the Dalit writers back then. No publication, no prestigious publication was publishing anything from these kind of writers. So it was a very big step in that sense to have this group give some sort of legitimacy to these writers. And I really wish that in context of the Hungryalists, this was more spoken of, because at that time nobody did it.
So do you think things have changed at all? I mean, I know in the same Kalam festival this year, we have Manoranjan Bapari coming in, and he's been in the news of late because his first translation has been immensely well received. And of course, we have publishers like Navayan, but we're really talking about one name here and one name there. And there was this anecdotal discussion we had earlier about my going through a book where this supposedly, where there's a lower caste character who is thinking about another person, and the term fellow is used. Now, fellow is not just upper class genteel. Fellow is almost tambram, and you can. There's no way that this particular character would have used the word fellow. And what surprised me was that yes, the author can perhaps miss it, but the editors also missed it. which possibly means that we are still a very, very non-diverse group. I mean, if there's a whole bunch of us missing an era like this.
I think we are very fond of saying that we have advanced, we have become modern. What I've seen over the years is the lack of sensitivity, whether it's caste or about class or about anything else. The lack of sensitivity has not changed, at least in my personal opinion. People who are sensitive throughout the ages. People who are not are not. Yes, certain things have maybe been bettered, let's say it that way, but there are then other classes, other barriers that have to be brought down, and there are just so many of them, you don't know where to begin.
So are you saying it's also very much a personal process and journey and a personal choice to develop it?
Yes, of course. And in many ways, if you look at the state of affairs in our country today, we have regressed. In many ways, we have regressed. We have gone back to times where we don't tolerate each other. I mean, so how modern are we?
True. Now, when I read this, you and I are women of this time and this day and this age, and I read some of the poetry. And of course, I cannot claim to have read all of it because I haven't. But I did feel that in some ways, especially technically or in terms of, the way the poetry was treated, it was definitely path-breaking, but in terms of women, and when the poets referred to women, I really saw, muse, goddess, object, refuge, but at least in the examples I read, I didn't see very many works about where women were empowered, independent, and an entirely different entity. I did find that a bit of a cliche. I'm not necessarily aware of the context. Like you, I was searching for context when I was reading the book. And I wondered if it was perhaps expected for the time, not expected, path-breaking, not at all. What's your view?
As a woman, obviously it does affect me that there has been no substantial work from the Hungryalists, or even a mention, from the feminine perspective. But having said that, I remember a certain advice that my professors in college gave me when we started with the English literature classes. He had said, when you read someone, read them with some charity. If you're already, biased in certain extents, then you've lost the plot already. So when I read, whether it's the Hungryalists or someone from the Kritibhaj group, I read with some charity. I keep an open mind. Having said that, I did not broach much of this topic on the feminine perspective of the Hungryalists in the book. I wanted to keep away from that because that's a huge, big story altogether. I did, but out of personal curiosity, and since I'm writing about the movement, I did ask Maitreyee Chowdhury and the several others, other Hungryalists, about why there has been no mention of it. So what they have told me is that at that time, the number of women writing were really, really less. The number of women who had a perspective to such writing were even lesser. And the number of women who wanted to be associated with the kind of brand that the Hungryalists had was even lesser. I mean, the Hungryalists had by then, gathered quite a reputation for themselves. So forget women. I mean, very few men writers also wanted to be associated with them unless you had that kind of a perspective. So women were relatively conservative even at that time. There's a mention of it in where Pradeep Chowdhury, one of the Hungryalist writers, shifts from Vishwabharati to Jadavpuri and is very surprised by the way men and women sit in separate columns, and talk to each other from a distance. So that was how the scenario was even at that time. So I thought that was fairly logical. I mean, women, because the Hungryalist writing was all about passion, it was all about difference. So I don't exactly say, yes, there was one Alo Mitro was there who was basically seeing Tridip Mitra at that time. So she was a firebrand of her own, but other than that, very, very few.
No, I asked because, of course, it had to be asked.
Yes, of course.
And the other thing is, of course, you could be a path breaker in terms of caste and perhaps not be a path breaker in terms of gender. There's no such magic box to tick. It's a journey, really. So one of the reasons why I'm also very excited about this book is because I did feel that it's quite an important book because it chronicles a certain very crucial cusp in our culture, in our history, cultural history of Bengal. Now, books like these could be bought and read, from publishing houses and bookshops by a few people, or they could be better utilized for the next generation and for all of us to appreciate that time more deeply. How would you like your book to be best utilized, Maitreyee?
If I were to give a Hungryalist reply to that, I think they don't give a shit about what happens. But if I were to give a personal reply, this is a book of labor, of intense research for almost 3.5 years. Like anybody else, the revolution and the firebrand part apart, I think both have their own places in life and they must be balanced out. So while the firebrand spirit should remain intact, the documentation of the Hungryalists as a place in history in Bangla literature should be relevant from this book part. And what can I say? Maybe make films on it, maybe write more columns on it, go review it. I'd like the audience to answer this, in fact. Anybody thinks this is relevant?
So how would you like to engage with this book? In what way, shape and form would you like to see it?
Yes.
I haven't read the book. That's my first honest confession. I came here because the author invited me, but I just sat over there and I have an idea of what it is.
In fact, we had a very interesting conversation on Facebook where I had written a piece of Alan playing the harmonium, and you had clarified with...
I'm interested in the subject for a different reason altogether. I see the movement as an intangible heritage, which I'm currently working on. Taking on from Walter Benjamin, his project on Arcadia, which I'm working on College Street currently. I think that many of these things are disappearing, and this movement also, after several years, you'll not find things around anymore, These letters, that people don't care. And many of these, though, have been found, including in my old office in ABP, Shunil Gangopadhyay's things are lost. Those which are in his house, maybe it has been retained. But those which were in his office, and there were many, they've just been thrown away. Now, what I'm saying is, I see it definitely as an intangible heritage, just like what we are having today as this Kalam Kohari's, cold storage in Free School Street suddenly disappearing because of the change of our culture, where a Hungarian trapeze artist, in 1937, he started a, Kuteret in Elliott Road, and he started all this. So I see it definitely as, as intangible heritage. And I think that is from where it will move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, yeah, sure.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate the writer for choosing up this topic. With the kind permission of the dais, I want to throw some information, some anecdotes, and finally one question for the writer. One information is that there was one Hungryalist poet whose name was Phalguni Roy. Okay, Tushar Roy, Phalguni Roy, they are both brothers, and there was one docu-feature on Phalguni Roy, and it was Ebong Phalguni, and it has been shown internationally. It should be known to everyone over here also, because she was telling that the films should be made. And secondly, in the previous literary meet in the previous year, I pointed out to Jeet Thel and Sandeep Roy that Sunil Gangopadhyay and Shakti Chattopadhyay were not Hungryalists. Okay, they were.
We'll come to that. Yeah.
Yes, they were not Hungryalists, but I don't know. No, they were not Hungryalists because they were into.
Shakti Chattopadhyay?
No, they catalyzed the movement. Okay, because they were carrying the legacy of the Kollol Juk. Okay, and another thing that you point out that Shubhimal Mishra wrote one book that was the first subaltern language used, but no ma'am, I apologize to contradict. Trailokanath Chakraborty did it previously. Kaliprashanna Singh did it in...
I didn't say it was the first subaltern.
No,
I said
in Bengali.
It was an interesting experiment that happened. I didn't say it was the first.
Oh, but it is not the first. Because
no, it is not.
Interesting as it is, we'll just carry on for a bit and we'll come back. We'll come back to you.
Okay.
So I'm really happy to see that people are very engaged. We will come back to you. But Maitreyee, before this thing warms up, because it is warming up, I wanted you to actually take up that point of Sunil Gangopadhyay and Shakti Chattopadhyay and their respective roles, because I remember perfectly well the fact that Krittibash was an established or fast establishing literary magazine or poetry magazine of the time, and this was a separate parallel movement. But I had always understood Shakti Chattopadhyay to be, at least in the initial stages, very much a part of the Hungryalist movement.
Yeah, completely. Shakti Chattopadhyay was one of the founder members of the Hungryalists. They were in Patna, Debi Roy, Shakti Chattopadhyay, Shomir Roy Chowdhury and Malay Roy Chowdhury. In fact, they sat in their Patna room. There's a scene in the book also. Sat in the Patna room and established the movement. The name of Shakti Chattopadhyay is very well documented with the Hungryalists. There's no doubt about that. So that's not contested.
And of course, he testified against.
Yeah, all that is there. There's no doubt about that. It's completely documented. So. No, I disagree. Respectfully, sir, I disagree. There was the manifesto of the Hungryalist show Shakti Chattopadhyay's name on it. So, no.
And I did think that he was always identified as one of the founder members. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's documented.
I'll in fact read out a thing from what Shankho Ghosh has written, and it's a direct quote what Shakti Chattopadhyay says. So, this is an essay by Shankho Ghosh, and he writes what Shakti had said. Shakti had written at the outset, the social environment in those countries, and he's talking about Allen Ginsberg in context to Allen Ginsberg's Beat movement. He says, the social environment in those countries is one of affluence. They can be beat or angry, but we are hungry. It must be termed a hunger for any form or aesthetic. No form or aesthetic can be left out. The main thing about this revolution is that it is omnivorous. Now these are Shakti Chattopadhyay's words, not mine.
This also delightfully turns into the direct, discussion towards Allen Ginsberg, and I wanted to keep it till the very end. Now, it's almost as if when we talk about the hungry generation, Allen Ginsberg's name is just there, like a parallel river. Yeah. And I wanted to understand from your perspective how influential he was, and in which possible ways do you feel his influence shaped the movement?
Ma'am, with due respect to you, please bear with me, whatever I say. I think the Hungryalists are very fond of saying that Allen Ginsberg did not influence them. But my reading of the situation is that a mind as large, as dynamic as that of Allen Ginsberg meets you, stays in your house, and you're not influenced does not happen. I think there was, yes, it's a fact that there was no collaborative work that came out. There was no mention of the Hungryalists in any of Allen Ginsberg's work, or vice versa. I mean, there was no mention of Allen perhaps in their work. But the fact that I don't agree that Maitreyee Roy Chowdhury is a poet himself. Shomi Roy Chowdhury is a very beautiful poet himself. They were friends. So I don't think that Allen could not have influenced them. So I really don't think so. At a personal level, that's my opinion, that a mind like his, he influenced people wherever he went. And he had a certain, if you see the interviews that Ginsberg has given, whether it is about his companions in the, like Kerouac, about Snyder, there is this immense generosity and the vision that he had for the beat movement. It's fantastic. And you see his, there are documents about that also, the documentation about his immense generosity for Maitreyee Roy Chowdhury and the Hungryalists when they were arrested. He did everything in his power to help them out, which many Indian writers did not, incidentally. So I don't think that he could not have been an influence. If he was not, he should have.
I'm going to open the house to questions now. I can't
tell you how delighted I am that you are here. I keep looking back at you. It's a surreal moment for me.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll start with you.
Okay, ma'am. First of all, let me explain why I will buy the book. I have not yet brought the book. See, there are 2 decades in our life, 40s and 60s, that reshaped the entire Bengal's political and social life. If we do not look at 1960 to 1969, when this movement was there, then I think my identification with Bengalis is totally incomplete. That is one of the reasons. My question to you is that when we go through this movement, we get many names, as you have mentioned, but one particular name which is never mentioned in Hungry movement. But his writing, his way of writing, his perspective, perception, everything is very much matching with other poets who were writing in that period. He is Birendra Chattopadhyay. My question is, why Birendra Chattopadhyay's name is surprisingly missing in this chronicle?
Sir, I cannot comment. In fact, if you read the book, and which I will request you to read, you will see that my role here, and as any other researcher's role, should be that of sitting at a little bit of a distance. That is where you see the best. You don't see the best when you're right out there. You see the best when you're at a little distance, which is why the fact that I'm a Prabhashi Bengali is perhaps better perspective, adds better perspective. So your question about why he wasn't there in the movement is something I really cannot answer. That is something for the Hungryalists to answer. And my job here is that of a researcher, of documenting what happened. It is not to invent and to question what did not. So I wrote only what I saw or what happened. I cannot write what did not happen but could have or should have. I cannot write on that.
It is a novel, in the sense I described it as a novel, but I don't want anyone to take that too literally. It is an extremely well-researched book, actually. My only intention there was to just tell you that it's a really difficult book to put down. It's a very, very, very fast read. Second question, anyone? Yes, please. If you have a loud enough voice, just shout.
Maitreyee, আমার দুটো প্রশ্ন ছিল। দেবরা দেবীর সাথে এবং অন্যদের সাথে আমি ইংরেজিতেই বলছি। The first one is more of a practical suggestion. বইটা সদ্ব্যবহার কি করে হয়? I think there's a whole politics behind the syllabi formulation in our country. So when I'm in power, the poets or the writers I'm fond of will be included in the syllabus. Therefore, when I have to chronologically or culturally represent the 30 or 40 years after Tagore, I will focus on Kollol and Krittibash and conveniently marginalize the others. So if the Hungryalists were part of the syllabus now, this will be lapped up as a critical text by the students, and you will have all the MS students rushing to College Street to buy a copy because it's going to help them with their answers. That's one thing. Amar arekta proshno hocche, there's a whole politics even during that time behind the inclusion and exclusion of writers from Pujo Shankha's. Because if you look at the Pujo Shankha or the Sharod Shankha, that is one wonderful way of classifying কোন লেখকের কৌলিন্য আছে এবং কোন লেখকের কৌলিন্য নেই।
কৌলিন্য, I love that word.
So that's the whole idea of including or excluding a writer from the mainstream by not having that person participate.
Who's pedigree and who's not, so to speak.
I would like to say something to this, and I have been asked this before. My approach to literature has always been do what you have to do and don't bother about who has not said this, who has not done this, and whatever. I have experienced this in my own life also. If somebody has to go up, if somebody has to be read, if they have to be remembered, they will be. If you have that determination, if you do good work, it will eventually be recognized. And yes, we live in a very, very convoluted world today, but in spite of that, all good work is recognized. And whether the Hungryalists were recognized or not, yes, there is that great politics that is there. I have seen all, I have read all of it. But as a writer and as a researcher of this book, I prefer to be a little detached from that politics, because otherwise I would not have been able to narrate it properly and as truthfully as it needs to be narrated. And a personal bit of advice, the love of literature is greater than the love of politics. So let's stick to that.
I don't think we could put this any more firmly or any more gracefully, Maitreyee. Thank you so much for being here. We have time for one last question. Before we wrap up, we have to, I'm told. One last question.
I'd like to read a letter, and since I'm in Kolkata, this is dedicated to Kolkata for my immense love for Kolkata, even though I don't stay here. But I'm taking the liberty of just taking
please.
1 minute. So like I said, I'm very fond of the letters over here. And this is a letter that the love interest of Molloy writes to. Her name is Tara. She writes to Molloy. It is 10, dear Molloy, it is 10 at night. The sun has gone down for ages now, and all that remains of the light is encapsulated in the halogen lamps placed at uneasy, random order. Beyond where I sit is the bust of a 19th century great. Pigeons have immortalized him. His expressions priceless since then. Ganga strolls by, the evening a witness to that saunter. I watch the immense energy of the little flies around the lamps. Red is their color. The raw skies itching to burst echo their color somehow, walking around like dreamers on no particular mission. I look at my coke laced in rum, black from the city's desire to hide. And while the sky and I converse in faraway homes, settled in the unknown of hunger, children cry in the heat. Someone will swear at the slow trams, and God will turn into a joker once again. I become Calcutta on its streets, and as the angel atop the dome in Victoria stretches its hands to touch something unattainable, I think it pretty much echoes the story of the people inhabiting the city. But tomorrow is another stormy day, with the hope that poetry will overcome it all. Tara. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is available to buy. Please do go and buy it in droves. It's a fantastic book. Maitreyee, once again, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you for asking all the right questions. Thank you for being with me. As Josh said, show me some love, buy the book. Thank you. And thank you for having such an engrossing discussion. Thank you for coming, all of you. The author